Thank you so much for braving the weather to come tonight. It's obviously ironic that I'm going to talk about the Dust Bowl on a night like tonight. You couldn't plan that. So, before we get started, I wanted to say that the New Mexico Museum of Art sits on unceded ancestral Tewa land, specifically Hogue, now present-day Santa Fe. I think it's also significant that today is Earth Day, which was not an accident. I wanted to give this talk on Earth Day because I felt that the subject matter that I'm going to discuss tonight is just perfect for Earth Day. I also wanted to get a few other things out of the way as by way of introduction. I want to thank Linda and William Reeves for graciously loaning their version of Drought Survivors to the museum for the exhibition Western Eyes. I also want to thank Christian Wagasback, who curated the Western Eyes exhibit, for agreeing to include the painting when I came to him and said, hey, I've got this really great painting that we can borrow. Can you include it in your exhibit? Which at that point was, 95% done, and he was gracious enough to say, oh yeah, it'll be a great addition. And personally, I think it is a great addition to what is already a fantastic exhibition. So if you've not seen Western Eyes or specifically seen the Alexandre Hogue Drought Survivors that is included in that, I highly recommend that you do. It's an amazing painting by a really fantastic artist who doesn't always get his due for being as interesting as he truly is. So. Anyway, and then finally, once again, thank you for coming out tonight. I really do appreciate it. I know it's sometimes tough to come out to these things on a Friday night, especially with the weather. That can always be a challenge. So what I'm going to talk about tonight actually is a pair of paintings, but specifically we're going to start with Alexandre Hogue's 1936 Drought Survivors, which is currently on view in the Western Eyes exhibition. This is what Hogue considered to be, at least the image, one of the most important paintings he ever created. In fact, it was so important that he painted it twice, and I'll talk about how it came into being in that respect. It belongs to his Erosion series from the 1930s. It depicts what was a North Texas farm, now rendered a desert because of drought and overcultivation. Only the rattlesnakes and prairie dogs can thrive in the desiccated environment that you see on the painting. It's inhospitable, obviously, to the cattle and even the tractor, which was partly culpable for the devastation pictured in it. Hogue's precise lines, striking palette, and detailed forms lend a stark yet horrifying beauty to the scene, something that Hogue himself certainly advocated. As he said at one point, and here's Hogue's self-portrait, Howdy Neighbor, from 1936, I was there on the ranch when the Dust Bowl began. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, and I had to paint it. Hogue actually was very much wrapped up in the Dust Bowl. There's a fascinating anecdote that I chose not to quote at length, but I'll give you here as a paraphrase. At one point he was caught in one of the black blizzards, so named because it was essentially a blackout condition where the dust was so thick that you couldn't necessarily see where you were headed. And he was out in his car driving down the road when one of these black blizzards came through, and he of course turned on the windshield wipers and he could see maybe about 10 feet in front of him. And when he got out of the car and after everything was said and done, he looked at the finish of his car and it would basically been pitted. It looked like a soft finish because the sand had really worn away the finish. So this was something he saw firsthand with his own eyes. It was not necessarily an attempt to hyperbolize what had happened, but he had really been stuck in it. Now, he called that approach psychorealism, a term that I think can be somewhat misleading, but what he meant about psychorealism is that he wanted to capture the psychological effect of what he saw in a sort of hyper-realistic way. And so he would say that what his approach was to not only see the Dust Bowl, but also feel its heat, its despair, its anguished death, the tragedy of its farmers. So you can see that on one hand, yeah, he wants to capture the psychological effect of the climactic conditions, but he's also very much interested in trying to capture the ramifications of that for the individual. So there's a great deal of empathy in what Hogue is attempting to do. So he first attempts to capture the aesthetic, I guess, of the Dust Bowl in 1933 with the painting of the same name. The pleasing yet unsettling patterns of the sand drifts, the broken barbed wire fences, that sublime wall of dust that threatens to blot out the sky entirely are all hallmarks of this series and highlight the horrors of drought and wind erosion in the 1930s. He followed the Dust Bowl with Drought-stricken area in 1934, a bleak depiction of the effects of drought on Texas farms. Hogue attempted to capture the tragedy and anguished death effectively in a scene that does seem quite hopeless. The farm's been almost entirely subsumed by the sand drifts in this painting. A single gaunt cow stares blankly at a trough that is unlikely to be filled given the dilapidated state of the windmill, an eventuality that only the buzzard seems to hope for. An imponderable cloud of dust threatens to bury the farm further. You can kind of see it's not always evident when you're looking at the painting, but if you look at that line that kind of bisects the windmill, that's the cloud of dust that's coming. And so this is a very kind of hopeless scene. It threatens death and destruction to everything that we see in the foreground, except perhaps for the buzzard. Drought survivors actually dates only a year after the worst of such blizzards, the so-called Black Blizzard of April 14th, 1935. April 14th is my birthday, by the way. So I can claim that as one of the interesting historic events on my birthday. Also, by the way, this is probably more information than any of you want, also the day the Titanic struck the iceberg and Lincoln was shot. So I live under a kind of interesting starred sky. So Hogue had actually, as I said, experienced one of these black blizzards. And so he really wanted to capture this and to warn other people of the reasons behind these black blizzards. You know, why is the Dust Bowl such a tragedy, and what can we do to prevent it in the future? And so what happens is that he will paint this erosion series, and he is then profiled in Life magazine. Now keep in mind, you know, these are the early days of Life magazine from 1937, but already it was a smashing success. You know, people were reading Life magazine across the nation. And so Hogue is identified as being the painter of the Dust Bowl in an article effectively titled The U.S. Dust Bowl. And it is a really important moment in his career for a variety of reasons. So what happens is he has this write-up, this 2-page spread. Drought Survivors is prominently featured as one of the key paintings of the Drought series. And the article was an attempt to really inform people, not in an exaggerated fashion, of really what was happening in the heartland of the country. Now, after the Life article, however, Hogue becomes very controversial. He was criticized as an upstart, and, quote, ignorant of the real situation and had painted isolated conditions. Well, from the photograph I just showed you, you know that these are not isolated conditions, but this was an attempt on the part of some, especially in Hogue's home state of Texas, to really kind of whitewash the scene and to argue against what was actually happening there. You know, these are isolated patches. You know, it's really nothing to worry about. But in fact, there was actually a lot to worry about. In fact, Milburn McCarty, the president of the West Texas Chamber of Commerce, said, quote, if these conditions ever did exist, they're very isolated instances. And so Hogue was really just kind of making a lot of this up as far as he was concerned. Hogue countered in the pages of the Dallas Morning News that he was not blaming all of agriculture. He was not blaming all farmers. In fact, he was often sympathetic to the farmer. But what he said was, I feel that the suitcase farmer is chiefly to blame. The man who lives in a tent, cultivates a patch, and then leaves the bare earth to blow up in the country's face. If the West Texas Chamber of Commerce would stop trying to soft pedal the thing and cooperate with the government, the evil might be corrected. Now, there's something interesting about this comment that I really want to draw your attention to because it's going to play out in what I'm talking about next. Notice that Hogue says this evil might be corrected. For him, this was not just an unfortunate climactic issue. This was a moral issue because it involved people's livelihoods. There were individuals that were suffering, individuals that were having to move, lose their their property, their way of living, and of course there was even death connected with this. So as far as Hogue was concerned, this was a moral issue. This was about people, this was about the land, this was about the future. And so he wanted to really emphasize that we had to take care of this not just as an isolated incident, but that this was something that deserved and demanded governmental and societal change. So the Dallas Morning News will cover this controversy, and they will characterize Hogue as an able painter, turns out to be an even more terrifying prophet. His pictures of death and destruction in the Dust Bowl have raised emotional dust storms among Texans, many of whom live hundreds of miles from the area now affected. Like Jeremiah and other predecessors in the craft, he is not unanimously honored in his own country. It's another interesting metaphor there, because they refer to Hogue as being a prophet, like Jeremiah, a biblical prophet that was warning, in this case, the children of Israel against their evil behavior. And so once again, there's kind of a moral tone that's set by the Dallas Morning News in equating Hogue with being this sort of prophet of the Dust Bowl and suggesting that what he's doing has a very religious dimension to it. And you'll see why this is important, but I'm just kind of setting it up right now. So Hogue would once again go back to the Dallas Morning News to respond to the controversy. He would often sort of champion what he was doing as being important. So following all of this bad press that he gets and his attempt to counter it in the Dallas Morning News, he will intensify what Life magazine in that article characterized as his scathing denunciation of man's persistent mistakes. However, he will also insist, although later in his career, that, quote, "I did not do the Erosion series as social comment." Are we getting an evacuation here? Dust storm warning for this area until 7:45 p.m. Be ready for sudden drop to zero visibility. Pull aside, stay alive. When visibility drops, pull far off the road and put your vehicle in park. Okay, so anyway. I don't know what else I do with this. So Hogue will say, quote, "I did not do the Erosion series as social comment. Social comment is negative. My interest in conservation is positive." Okay, so for Hogue, once again, it's an attempt to find a moral failing and correct it. And so he's dealing with what he considers to be moral issues, not just criticism, but really a way of saying, look, what we need to focus on is not the mistakes that have been made, but what we do to correct them. How do we correct them? We correct them through conservation. And so conservation was one of the big buzzwords of the day. I'm sure you all know that. It's still an important word, though we don't use it as often as we used to. And so what Hogue will do is to encourage people to think about efforts towards conservation to avoid the mistakes of the Dust Bowl. So, although it's not necessarily readily apparent in paintings like Drought Survivor, contemporary thought on conservation did shape Hogue's perspective. And I want to talk about what that contemporary thought was. So one of the leading figures in Depression-era ecological thought was Frederick Clements. He was with the Carnegie Institution at the time, and he characterized ecology as a concern for biological wholeness, in which humans, animals, and plants act, quote, as organs working in unison within a great organism. It's a fascinating way to think about the environment, one that I think now we take a little bit more for granted as having some resonance. But in the 30s, this was a kind of a radical idea that everything was working in concert, that if you did something with your land, it might affect the land next to you, or perhaps have ramifications well beyond that. So Hogue is certainly in touch with Clements' thought. Another major thinker of conservation thought during the 1930s is Aldo Leopold. Leopold would go even further and would characterize nature as, quote, a state of mutual interdependent cooperation between human animals, other animals, plants, and the soils, which may be disrupted at any moment by the failure of any of them. So for Leopold, it was this idea that we were all living in a delicate balance, and disruption at any point could in fact create a calamity such as the Dust Bowl, which was in fact what happened. And we'll talk about some of the reasons behind that here in a second. But that's one of the things that Hogue is very conscious of. So this theoretical model that we see from Leopold, that we see from Clements, emphasizes symbiosis or interdependence among nature's disparate parts that must be maintained in order to prevent ecological failure. It also identified the introduction of monoculture agriculture into a relatively fragile grasslands ecosystem as the culprit behind widespread erosion, placing the onus on humanity's disregard for ecological balance. And so people like Clements, people like Leopold, and Hogue will essentially say that, look, the Great Plains, this vast savanna grassland, is great for grazing, because of course the bison had used it for centuries as grazing, but it was perhaps not so great for farming. It's not that it was entirely unsuitable, but what it was unsuitable for was the lack of diversity in the environment. And so the minute you plow the grasslands, you introduce monoculture agriculture, namely wheat agriculture, it becomes a problem. And so one of the things that the government tries to do during this time is to encourage farmers to plant multiple crops or to rotate their crops instead of continually planting the same thing over and over. I should also add that Leopold will say that that Americans have to rethink their relationship with the environment. So not only can we not just do what we want to with nature because it will fail if we do the wrong things, we have to think about nature as something that is a little bit more precarious. At one point he says that we should no longer think of progress as, quote, the enslavement of a stable and constant earth, and he encourages Americans to consider a more ethical treatment of nature based in conservation. And so Leopold, like Clements, like Hogue, is really trying to encourage a change of thought in the 1930s. Now, the writer and poet Archibald MacLeish will take it one step further, and he becomes, I think, kind of very polemical about this, whereas Leopold and Clements, I would say, are really trying to urge Americans to think differently. MacLeish is really trying to shock them. And so in the November 1935 issue of Fortune magazine, he writes an article titled Grasslands. Okay, grasslands, that sounds relatively benign. The article is anything but. He will take these biological metaphors one step further in an expose. He will point to the agricultural boom following World War I as the primary cause behind soil erosion, and he criticizes, in particular, agricultural industrialization on the Great Plains as a form of exploitation. In various articles, and you can see the one on the right, he will define erosion as a cancer of the earth and, quote, an ill resulting from injury to the vegetative cover. So he takes that biological metaphor and he goes one step further. Erosion is a cancer of the earth caused by this poor treatment. In order to prevent what he also says is a landscape of a murder, the only way to avoid that is through the healing humbleness of grass as a physical and moral antidote to greed and indifference. So basically what MacLeish is saying is, look, we have essentially murdered our environment through industrial agriculture, through plowing under the grasslands, through monoculture planting. What we've got to do is we've got to get back to the grasslands. We've got to restore the savanna in order to create the suitable climatic conditions necessary. So MacLeish, like Hogue, will see grass as a victim of gluttonous desire, and even the suggestion that human lives were intimately connected to the fate of the flora. At the beginning of his essay, MacLeish will confront readers with a notable passage from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 6, which is, all flesh is grass. So like some of these other writers, the biblical metaphor comes back in. Hogue is thought of as being this kind of prophet like Jeremiah. McLeish evokes Isaiah 40, verse 6. And so these biblical metaphors help to, once again, really emphasize that this is a moral dilemma. We're murdering the land. We're torturing the earth, creating a cancer in the earth. So this attempt to kind of make this a moral question is something that you find over and over and over, and it is something that is key to Hogue's paintings. So the plow becomes an instrument of murder in one of Hogue's most well-known conceptions, Mother Earth Laid Bare, Erosion number 2 from 1938. The painting depicts a field in which the farmer has plowed downhill, allowing water erosion to wash away topsoil and reveal both the subsoil and a great feminine form whose throat has been cut by the plow in the foreground. So you can see that large gash in the Mother Earth's throat there. Although this was based on a location near Dallas, Hogue actually completed the painting in Taos, New Mexico, and asked for criticism from his colleagues, which included Ernst Blumenschein and Andrew Dossberg. It was actually kind of funny when they were talking about this painting and its significance. Blumenschein, who we all think of as being this really remarkable painter with a great visual acuity, didn't even recognize the feminine form at first. So he starts talking about the criticism of this painting and all these forms, and he doesn't even realize that there's this great Mother Earth form that has basically been murdered at the center of the composition. Now, what's interesting about this is that the painting was informed by a couple of things. First of all, his mother. Mattie Hoover Hogue was I think, very important in Alexander's development. And at 6 weeks old, Alexander and his family moved to Denton, Texas, where his father was a Presbyterian minister. The youthful Hogue will assist his mother, Mattie, in the garden frequently, and she would often speak of the Mother Earth and respect for the Mother Earth as being something that was important to the family and should be important to him as he was maturing. And so she engenders in Alexander this vision, as he said, of a great female figure under the ground everywhere, a figure which might be injured if one were not careful. But that wasn't the only influence on Hogue as he begins to think about this painting. The religious beliefs of Taos Pueblo also informed what he was doing. Hogue said that when I was researching Taos Indian folkways and religion, about which I was writing, because he did actually write an article about Taos beliefs, he said, I suddenly had to return to the idea when I found that these Indians had an identical concept of a great female figure under their fields, the Earth Mother, who was fertilized by the Sky Father, Poseyemo, symbolized by the sun. And so Hogue, as he's working in Taos, has this sort of revelation, puts the two and two together, the contemporary article that he's writing on Taos belief and his youthful education by his mother. So I should note that this idea of this feminine construct of nature is something that Hogue is very interested in. It's not something he sticks with for his entire career, but he's not attempting to suggest that the feminine form is inherently passive, is necessarily a how else do I want to put it? Is something that is easily subjected or should be subjected to violation. Rather, I think what Hogue is attempting to do is to animate nature with this feminine persona out of a deep maternal respect, a concern for the sanctity of both the body and of nature, the violation of either of which would have resulting or disaster or would result in disastrous ramifications. And in fact, in his next painting of the Erosion series, he basically configures nature as a masculine body. In The Crucified Land from 1939, which was the last official painting from the Erosion series, he not only once again continues that reverence for nature as a sacred body, but he also, I think, makes his most cogent statement on the ecological relationship between nature and human beings, and in addition to that, an emphasis on conservation. So in this Denton, Texas wheat farm, the farmer has used a tractor to plow downhill, creating the ideal opportunity for water erosion, very similar to what we saw in Mother Earth Laid Bare. Hogue specifically situated the farm in the North Texas Redlands, quote, to symbolize that the fact that the water is cutting into the very flesh of the earth, draining it of its lifeblood, crucifying the land, unquote. A cruciform scarecrow wearing the typical clothing of the American farmer teeters on the edge of one of the gullies formed by the runoff. The red clay soil of the farm emulates the blood and flayed flesh of the Passion. It also warns of the destruction of an American Eden. It was often during this time that the heartlands were thought of as this sort of new American Eden, this kind of fertile land that was in effect sort of the promise of God's beneficence on the American people. And so here you have the sort of warning of the destruction of the American Eden through serpentine gullies that slither back into the farmland, corrupting its fertile potential. Americans now are threatened with the loss of their paradise to what Hogue considered, quote, the evil effects of erosion, unquote, which were prompted by an equally destructive drive for profit. So what he's doing here is, once again, an attempt to kind of really construct this sort of moral dilemma. And in that respect, it differs a little bit from what others are doing in the 1930s to highlight the effects of the Dust Bowl. Two really prominent examples would be Per Lorentz's film, The Plow That Broke the Plains from 1936, which also indicts industrial agriculture as a primary cause for the Dust Bowl. And I also wanted to bring in Dorothea Lange's, one of her better-known photographs, Tractored Out, Childress County, Texas, from 1938, which once again, like Per Lorentz, emphasizes that it was the tractor, it was the mechanical apparatus that was largely responsible for stripping away the grasslands, for removing the topsoil, and ultimately creating the conditions when you add drought to the mixture that creates a plot of land that could be effectively tractored out. Hogue, by contrast, but I want to say, he's also in sympathy with what's happening with Lange and Lorentz. Hogue does not suggest that erosion is merely the result of bad husbandry, but really a moral failing rooted in the fundamental belief systems of Western civilization. Now, Hogue's concern for ecological interdependence in the later works, I think, helps to illuminate his intent in Drought Survivors. Dubious farming practices on the Great Plains created a precarious situation, and when drought hits in the early 1930s, the Dust Bowl comes into being. Hogue's clarion call for conservation insists that humanity must consider its place within the fabric of nature or risk the fate of the cattle that we see here in the foreground. Life in the form of rattlesnakes and prairie dogs may continue, but humanity's place in all of that is uncertain at best. And I think it's really brought to home, and you can see this in the version of the painting that we have in the exhibition. But if you look at the cow on the right, where obviously the hide has pulled away, you can see grass, needle grass, growing up within the carcass of that cow. So Hogue is not necessarily prophesying complete apocalypse. This is not the end of the earth. This is rather just the end of perhaps humanity's place on the earth. So given the ramifications of Drought Survivors, it's little surprise that not everyone sympathized with the message of human culpability. We've already talked about the West Texas Chamber of Commerce and their antipathy towards what Hogue was saying. But it actually went a step further. A group from North Texas took up a collection to buy this painting just so they could burn it at the stake. They got together a collection of $50, went to Dallas, only to find out that Hogue was asking $2,000 for the painting. So they went home a little crestfallen. But I should say that that was not the end of the story for this painting. So Hogue actually does eventually get his asking price. It was purchased in 1938 from the 1938 Paris International for the Jeu de Paume. The exhibition had been originally organized by the Museum of Modern Art, the title of which was 3 Centuries of Art in the United States. And you can actually see the painting hanging in that photograph of the exhibition in the lower left. I'm sorry, it's a low-res photograph. It's the best that I could find, but you can see it at the far left of that photograph. So this was a really major step for Hogue. Here he is included in this major exhibition of basically the canon of American art. He was one of the few contemporary artists included, and the French singled his painting out as the one to buy because they considered it quintessentially American. There was something about it that was stylistically and thematically identifiable, and they thought, this is a perfect example of contemporary American painting. So, it is purchased by the French government. With the advance of Hitler, however, during World War II, the painting was transferred back to the Museum of Modern Art for safekeeping, and then it was returned back to the French government in 1946. So it makes that trip across the Atlantic a couple of times. It's then loaned to a special exhibition at the Tate. Yes, that Tate. So then it goes to Great Britain for a brief time. And then finally, after the close of the Tate exhibition, it goes back to France where it's stored in a warehouse. Ironically, a fire breaks out in the warehouse and burns the painting. The French government considers the painting, which you see the black and white photo up left of what was left, basically a total loss. They write to Alexandre Hogue and say, look, this painting has been burned. There's really nothing we can do by current standards to hold on to this painting, so we're going to destroy it. The correspondence goes back and forth for a while. Hogue is obviously very distraught about this. He still wants the French government to have one of his paintings, so eventually they negotiate the sale of a later painting, Oil in the Sand Hills, which was part of a series of paintings examining the petroleum industry, to the French government, where in fact it still is. For the next 4 decades, Hogue basically has in the back of his mind, this is one of his best paintings. He wants to recreate it. And so he keeps thinking about how he's going to recreate drought survivors. Now, all he has of drought survivors at this point is his memory and a black and white photograph. And so he keeps thinking about it, and then finally, in 1984, he decides to repaint it from that photo and from memory for his retrospective exhibition at the Philbrook Museum of Art, Nature's Forms, Nature's Forces. And that's the catalog that you see there. And so I'm going to head back, however, to the painting. And so the painting in the lower right is what you see of his second conception, and that's what we have here in the exhibition. It was, for him, a way to make sure that what he considered to be his most important ecological statement lived on. And so he recreates the painting in actually a palette that is more striking than the original. What he does not know at the time is that the French government did not destroy the painting, even though they had said that they would. And so that painting sat in its dilapidated state in a warehouse, and eventually, I think it was in the 1990s, they have it conserved with obviously much advanced technique, and it now is in the French government's collection. Hogue never knew that, so he died thinking that painting was still destroyed, did not know it had been recreated. So now there are 2 paintings that exist. And interestingly, and I'm sure the Reeves would be happy to hear me say this, the second conception is actually more interesting. Not only was Hogue more accomplished as an artist, he was still relatively young when he painted the Erosion series in the 30s, but so he has perhaps a better command of the brush. Certainly the palette is brighter and more interesting. That image is a little more intense than it should be, but it's actually not far off from the range of color that he chose. The blues are more satisfying, the reds are more satisfying, and he attempts to suggest that continuity between the animal forms and the nature around them through those kind of serpentine lines that Hogue in particular excels at. So when you look at the sand dunes and you see those kind of great sinuous lines that run across those dunes, those also run across the desiccated carcasses of the cows. And so Hogue is meaning to suggest that there is, this commonality between the death of this land, which is now obviously covered by these dunes, and the death of the cows. So it is at once beautiful and horrifying at the same time. And I think the dust storm that is threatening at right is more prominent in this painting. And so it's hard to lose sight of what he was really after when he painted this image. He really did intend this as a warning to us. We have to think about our place in nature. We have to think about nature as one that is interdependent, interconnected, and that our role in that is pivotal. And if we don't pay attention to what we're doing, if we don't pay attention to the signs around us, we're going to wind up just like these cows. And will the rattlesnakes miss us? Will the prairie dogs miss us? No, they won't. And so for Hogue, this painting becomes a really forceful statement. And that was why he chose to repaint it. And we're very fortunate to have it in this museum as part of this fantastic exhibit, Western Eyes. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really do appreciate it. Happy to take any questions if you have them. Forgive my verbal missteps along the way. I get really enthusiastic about a topic like this, so occasionally I trip over my own tongue, and I apologize for that. But any questions? Yes?
So did Hogue, from the time of 1936 through his death, did he continue to paint these kind of environmental, moral, biblical types of paintings, or did he do other things?
Okay, it's a very good question. For those of you that may not have heard, did Hogue continue to paint these kinds of moral sermons on ecology? Which is not exactly the way that you put it, but hopefully that's what you meant, yeah. Actually, no, he did not. The Erosion series more or less comes to an end in 1939. He does paint one more painting within the Erosion series, but that's actually at the request of Encyclopedia Britannica. And what he goes on to do from here is very interesting. He does a series in the 1940s that is really, also perhaps ironically, a kind of positive image of the petroleum industry in Texas. And so in the 40s, he's painting about the petroleum industry. He paints in the 1950s a variety of images about technology. He gets really abstract for a while and paints all of these images about a kind of primeval environment. He does a series of numbers in kind of a very pop style. So he really sort of ranges around. There's a great painting he does actually that I would also like to have here, and I need to kind of get in contact with the owner someday because I just think it would be perfect for New Mexico. He actually does a series about the furor over UFOs in the 1950s and how people are spotting UFOs everywhere. It's actually, I mean, I should say I kind of want it here, but I kind of don't because it's a fascinating topic, but not such a great painting. But anyway, so no, actually, at the end of his career, he's painting images of Big Bend. And they're beautiful images of the sort of, stark desert landscape of Big Bend, but they have no discernible ecological sensibility, and they're certainly not as strident as these paintings.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes?
Were they the same, similar size, the French painting and the...
Yeah, they're almost identical in size. Yeah. I saw, yes?
Has anybody speculated if there was any intentionality or what that might?
No. Put simply, no. I mean, and these paintings have been written about quite a bit. The problem with somebody like Alexandre Hogue, unfortunately, is that he became so well known for these Erosion series paintings that he almost kind of suffered from having painted something that was so meaningful because people often didn't see beyond them. And so they've been written about quite a bit, but no one has ever suggested there was any meaning behind the calligraphic character of the barbed wire. But that's an interesting observation. Thank you. Yeah.
How old was he in 84?
How old was he in 84? He would have been, I think he was born in 1898, so 86. I think it's 1898. Is that correct? Bill, do you know? Okay. I think, yeah, I mean, he was born roughly around the turn of the century, so. Yeah, certainly towards the end of his career. And I think he died in 94, in his 90s, if memory serves. Yes?
Is there a particular museum
Actually, a lot of it is in this part of the country. And so I can tell you, well, obviously, this painting's here at the moment. That painting is in the French collection, the state collection, by the way, I should mention. That is at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa. That is at the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa, so you can see two of his major paintings there. He actually, I should say, he taught at the University of Tulsa in the latter half of his career. So I think it was maybe in 1944, 45, towards the end of World War II, he goes to the University of Tulsa and essentially is one of the most prominent Tulsa artists for the last, 50 years of his career. And that's why I think his major paintings wound up there. Let me see. Drought-stricken area is at the Dallas Museum of Art. And then the Dust Bowl is owned by the Smithsonian. There are a lot of museums that have his paintings, but these are really the prominent ones. The Oklahoma City Museum of Art has the revisited Erosion series painting that was done for Encyclopedia Britannica. So yeah, you don't have to go too far to see Alexandre Hogue, and in most cases these paintings are almost always out because they're so important. Yeah?
Did he ever do a painting of the Black Blizzard, or is it just a photograph?
He did. The Dust Bowl painting that you see there is probably as close as it gets. But he did do another painting and a couple of lithographs. There were a couple of things I didn't show you that I took out on my talk. And I can show you some of these things that are kind of interesting. I promise I won't spend a lot of time on this. But here's one of his more prominent, or more popular, I should say, lithographs, The End of the Trail, which has many of the same elements you just saw. But actually, I think the one that was his bestseller, let me see if I can, sorry, these are the slides I cut out, so ignore what you're seeing. Actually, that was it. No, I don't have it. Sorry, I was going to make a comment about one of the former senators from Oklahoma, and I chose not to. One of his most popular lithographs actually is called Rattlesnake, and it's essentially an image of the snake in Drought Survivors, and everybody told him, "Why are you making this lithograph? No one's going to want to buy a lithograph of a rattlesnake," and he sold out within a month. Go figure. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you for being such a great audience. I really appreciate it.